What can matter be? This is a question for science and for philosophy, and it opens a space for a dialogue between scientist and philosopher, the one in search of facts, and the other in search of meaning. Holding contrasting viewpoints together without dropping one for the other tends to open hidden lines of reasoning that go beyond what we already know. This is important in what follows. One example we could take of dealing with contrasting viewpoints is the case of the large dinosaurs. On one hand, there's irrefutable evidence that they lived here on Earth. On the other hand, rational arguments in accordance with physics and biology show they couldn't have been as they appear to be, because, to mention just one point, their bones are too frail to support such a massive body. Do we take the empiricist stand, ignore the contradiction, and simply say they obviously existed and go on from there, say making dinosaur movies? Or do we hold to the contradiction and allow for a novel solution to emerge in time, as it has in the context of the electric universe? In this view, the electrical environment influences the mass of a body and therefore its force of gravity. With this understanding, the Earth's gravity could once have been greatly reduced and would have allowed life forms to grow to different proportions than today, and for dinosaurs, huge but not heavy, to step lightly across continents. It's possible for the mass of the Earth to have been much lower, while the matter making up the Earth remained the same. Mass is not matter, and an understanding of mass does not offer an answer to the question, what is matter? The nature of matter is a separate question and requires a separate answer. We can begin by describing the characteristics of matter. Surely they're so evident there should be no question. By matter, we refer to objects we encounter with our physical body, that is, with our body senses. On the scale of our macro world, matter is what we bump into. And why the bump? Because material objects occupy a certain space at a certain time. This implies matter subsumes the presence of space and time. Another fact we associate with matter is unequivocal presence. It's there, or it's not there, and has no in-between state. If you want the piano to stand in the corner, well, the pot with the ficus tree has to go elsewhere. This model of reality works well for our macro world, and it also functions for cells under the microscope, but shift down to a scale of the atom and the subatomic, and the same model doesn't apply. For one, on this scale, objects apparently don't touch. They have electric fields, and this is equivalent to having a distended object that's less present at a distance from the center. A full description of the subatomic realm is not necessary at this point, and has been mentioned only to ask a further question. To accommodate the subatomic realm, do we need to construct a separate, different model of reality? Probably not. And why not? The incongruence between these two worlds results from not taking into account a description of perception. Our first step should be to grasp how perception gives rise to the world we know. To make my point, here's an anecdote. Once a group of specialists came before God and said, "You're no longer needed. We're able to produce life on our own." God, ever accommodating, replied, "Well, most certainly. You just show me that you can create life and I'll graciously leave." Well, the specialists bent down, took up a handful of dirt, and proceeded to create life. "Wait a minute," was God's retort. "That's mine. You've got to take your own dirt. Our search for matter begins not with a description of the already present objective world, but prior to this, at the preconceptual state. To go there seems all but impossible, but we can try. Here's an experience of a precognitive encounter for you to test right now in your mind. Imagine you get a whiff of a strange and mysterious scent, a fragrance, and you don't know from where it is or what it is. Stay with it. What would that feel like? Fully absorbed by the experience, it's possible to lose all sense of self and other and just be that mysterious feeling the fragrance brings. That suspended state then gets broken the moment the conscious mind enters and forms concepts. At that moment, nirvana is lost and you declare, I smell something special. The encounter between our body senses and whatever is does not create the world. There's no perceived object and no perceiving subject until mind steps in and formulates the experience in this way. We can divide the process of perception into 3 stages. First, the precognitive, of which we can say nothing. It's the interchange with all that is that precedes the conceptual consciousness. This brings, then, the special out-of-conscious moment, that is the integration of multiple features. The outcome is the 3rd stage, the event of perception, the entry of that object into consciousness, or stated otherwise, the awakening of consciousness of that object. Understanding the middle step, the moment of integration, is crucial and was the subject of an earlier short video on the site of the Thunderbolts project. Here I give 2 further examples of the stage of integration. The first example, seeing a mountain. Looking at a mountainside, diverse features catch our attention: rocks, cliffs, streams, vegetation. However, all these individual items exit from our conscious mind for the split second that brings the global sense mountain. A hidden act of integration brings together features that fuse to produce the recognition mountain. In addition to the observed features, personal attitudes, experiences, knowledge, and feelings enter that moment of integration. They influence the impact and meaning that the sense mountain has for each of us. This moment of integration contains far more than we might first imagine. For example, light intensity is variable. The brightness we observe of any one area in the field of view depends on surrounding areas. In order for the image we see to form, a scale of intensities of luminosity has to be established for the whole scene. Various processes, such as this, take place in that split second before the image forms. Amazing, isn't it? A second example is 3D vision. The experience of depth points clearly to the simultaneity present at the moment of integration. A common explanation is that it's possible to calculate the distances of what we see from the parallax difference between the views of our 2 eyes. But the experience of depth is not measuring distance. It's a way of being in the world and of sensing connection with our surroundings. We're all familiar with the feeling of a jolt when a 2-dimensional view opens out to 3 dimensions. And generally, opening to a 3D view brings a sense of elation. Calculation with an algorithm is a sequence process and will not explain the simultaneity that creates presence. By holding steadfast to the contradiction that arises when two images, one from each eye, are superimposed, each element that is seen vies for its place in a coherent, single, unified view, and resolution is achieved through depth vision. And without this, how could we imagine a world in 3D? And without the sense of volume, how could we conceive of physical objects? We couldn't. Let's linger a little with that moment of integration. I choose to emphasize 3 points. Firstly, an empty center. Objects we perceive have no central something that makes them what they are. They are not built Lego-like out of unit components. Instead, they arise out of the communion between multiple features that, in a timeless moment, integrate. The second point, not conscious. The integration happens in an out-of-conscious moment. It's achieved through the activity of the non-conscious mind, or what I refer to as the expanded mind. The third point, timelessness. The integration is achieved through the simultaneous interchange between all that gives meaning and form to the perceived object. It's the simultaneous interrelationship of many that forms a unit. What gives birth to every single object we perceive is an act of integration. The simultaneous interrelation of multiple features in a preconscious moment generates our conscious perception of objects. Now we've a conundrum. On one hand, we personally enact the process of integration that generates the objects we perceive. On the other hand, if we're not there, creating these objects, then what? Shouldn't they disappear? Here's the response of a baffled philosophy student. There once was a man who said, God must think it exceedingly odd if he finds that this tree continues to be when there's no one about in the quad. Dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I'm always about in the quad. And that's why the tree will continue to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. We're caught here in a contradiction. Do we take the empiricist position that the world obviously exists and ignore the contradiction? Or do we ignore the physical side of the contradiction and glibly claim that all is non-material spirit? An answer will come in its time. We just need the steadfast determination to hold the contradiction without jumping to conclusions, as the rhymer of this limerick did. What has been noted so far is that an act of mind is required to produce the physical objects we perceive. This simple fact dispels the mind-matter duality so common in our thinking, and instead signifies the counterintuitive conclusion that matter, as we know it, is a product of the mind. How strange this may seem at first. Matter is born in the mind. Can it be so? The further we delve, the more this fact becomes evident. With this, a curious question arises. If an object is born in the mind, can it be solid? I mean, if objects are made in the mind, can you trust the chair you're about to sit on to hold your weight? Despite the fact that you sit down on the chair, it is a mind object. A contradiction? Not so, if we take time to unravel it. Physical experience, as noted, is the unthinkable exchange between body and all that is. We had the example of fragrance, and the interaction with solid objects is no different. The pre-conceptual ongoing experience, neither subjective nor objective, is inaccessible to the conscious mind. Then, when the mind steps in, it breaks this hallowed state and codifies it into chair, body, sitting. The conscious mind knows only that which becomes codified into objects. Sitting on a chair is the mind's formulation of a physical encounter. We have absolutely no knowledge of what that encounter consisted of. We only know what it is after applying the codification system we habitually employ that matches our present understanding. We return to the opening question, what can matter be? Are we asking here, 1. What is matter made of? Or 2. How do you recognize matter? What is it we refer to as matter? We look at these two separately. 1. What is it made of? The moment we ask of some entity, what is it made of, we've abandoned that entity and we're looking for other matter that fills it, and not for what it is itself. The matter of a mountain is being a mountain. To look for matter on the inside regresses to the ever more minute, until we're asking for the matter of subatomic particles. Here, below the threshold of the periodic table of elements, what matter do you expect to find? Some cosmic dust? And then, finally, we realize we've gone astray. And what we're actually looking for is something to fill the object that's a concept we created in our mind. The question we meant to ask is, what is it we refer to as matter? Or simply, how do we recognize matter? But the detour through the wrong question bears its fruit. If I'm not mistaken, there's the restatement here of Gödel's incompleteness theorem through a different form. Can we really build an integral whole from the inside by assembling component parts? It's an impossibility. The complement of this is instead how, through integration, we build a whole from without. Now, back to question 2. How do we recognize matter? What is it we refer to as matter? There's the general term matter, and there's the more specific term physical matter. First, the general term. Let's keep in mind what was already shown. Matter is what the mind creates when it breaks off a piece of the continuing flux of experience and allows it to form a self-contained unit. It then has otherness from the perceiver, or what's called objectivity. To be called matter, an item has to have an identity. It's recognized as something. For example, oh dear, what can the matter be? Johnny so long at the fair. The matter is a whole problem that the distressed young Irish lass has formed in her mind. She's surely right. Dublin's Donnybrook Fair was infamous. But for us, the matter is the fact that something takes form as a separate entity and becomes an object of attention. This is matter in its general usage. Most often we speak of matter in reference to a physical, material object. In this case, the entity referred to engages our sense organs and is recognized as present in the three-dimensional world. Physical matter can be visual, auditory, tactile, or a mysterious fragrance. Physical matter is not a particular substance, it's a particular, anything particular. A particular particle, for example, or a mountain. To understand how this is possible, we need to recognize the single factor that determines whether the matter we refer to is a physical object or whether it's an idea present only in the mind. This unique, distinguishing feature is that physical matter occupies a particular space and resists the entry of another physical object into the same space. This resistance, or obstruction, is what we encounter with our body's senses. Our physical senses signal a presence is present, but do not recognize the encounter to be an object. To perceive it as an object and to recognize what that object is requires an act of mind. Without the mind, there can be no thing. This view of matter comes rather suddenly, and you might exclaim, but nothing has been answered. Not so. There is an answer. Matter is anything that has an identity and is recognized as an object. Thoughts and concepts are mind matter, attributed to the mind only. Material objects are attributed to the physical world we experience through our bodies. Matter, in the sense of physical matter, is an impression produced when the experience of an occupied volume of space is interpreted by the mind as the presence of an object. To say that physical matter is the object we encounter with our body is in perfect accord with our common understanding. The only difference, and this makes all the difference, is that the material object we encounter and recognize is empty of specific content. It's a presence we encounter in a particular volume of space, but nothing attributes it with substance. It is material, and yet its physicality is the occupied space and nothing more. You may be tempted to return with the claim that the material object has specific components. However, as was noted earlier, the components of an object are simply other objects, and they, likewise, have no ascertainable content. In looking for components, we enter an analytical process that we inaugurate only after recognition of the object as some particular thing. Matter, we discover, is not determined by its content. In the material objects we recognize as being present in the physical world, substance plays no part and is, in fact, irrelevant. This view of matter has its antecedents in philosophy. Specific parallels can be found in the work of Plotinus, who lived some 1800 years ago. Already before then, in Plato and Aristotle, we're told that physical objects are not matter on its own, but consist of matter together with form. To these ancient philosophers, matter on its own is not perceptible. For Plotinus, matter is something preconceptual, in his words, like sight in darkness. In terms of what has been said here, matter in Plotinus could be understood as the anticipation of all that can be perceived. It's described as a substanceless substrate that sustains all that we observe as physical. Without entering more deeply into the subject, here are a few phrases of Plotinus taken from chapter 4, book 2 of the Enneads. We should not attribute to matter's nature any of the properties which are observed in sense objects. Matter is bodiless. That which wants to be thought about matter will not be a thought, but a sort of thoughtlessness. The soul immediately imposes the form of things on matter, because matter's indefiniteness distresses it, as if it were in fear of being outside the realm of being. We return now to the earlier suggestion that the model we use for the macro everyday world is also applicable on an atomic scale. I briefly mentioned three possible arguments. Firstly, the empty center of all objects was noted. Maybe the same is true on a subatomic scale. An electric field generates the impression of a central object. The Boscovich atom was an early proposition in the direction of an empty center, and Michael Faraday pursued this idea. It's a hypothesis that has remained open till today. Secondly, the timeless moment of integration in which everything interrelates in simultaneity. Could the same immediate connection be true in phenomena we observe in the universe on all scales? Gravity, in Newton's world, was an instantaneous force, and despite the speed limit introduced by Einstein, there's reason to believe that gravity acts on all bodies in real time and without delay. Could this be just one example of such immediate connection? The third point goes deeper. It concerns the tendency of the mind to produce independent units we know as concepts. Forming concepts is actually an example of a more general phenomenon we observe throughout nature. For example, in the animate world we find the formation of cells, and in the inanimate world there's the tendency to form crystals and structures that arise within plasma. Why not consider that the mind in forming units is in fact responding to a universal tendency that is present in the natural world, the tendency to form independent units? This thought suggests answers to diverse questions. For instance, if the subatomic particle is substanceless, what then holds the charge to a position in space? Well, fields on their own tend to form separate units, and there's no requirement for a physical presence. Or, to the question, how does the tree continue to be in the quad when there's no intelligent observer? The answer: both mind matter and physical matter participate in the same proactive movement that creates independent, intelligible units. With this realization, dualism vanishes. To end this study of matter, I add this brief recapitulation. So what is matter? It's anything that has gone through the process of integration and become some particular thing. Sense organs don't know an object is present. For that, we need the intervention of mind. A good example is warmth. You feel warmth, but have no concept of anything and no sense of it being other than you. Warmth can be just an experience until, in our mind, we form the concept of warmth and are then able to speak about it as something. Then it becomes the matter being referred to. There is no more substance to the matter of a mountain than to warmth. All objects are equally real. Mountain, love, warmth, or beauty. Physical reality has to do with our encounter with a volume of space that resists the entry of another physical object. This brings us to consider what we encounter with our body senses as physical matter. But the matter part is not substance, but the fact that it has formed a self-contained unit. It may be that our cultural heritage, with its emphasis on objectivity, makes this tale more difficult to tell. To conclude, I add an epilogue describing a less discussed fact of visual perception. When we look at how the eye functions and its contribution to our view of reality, there are surprises. All we see in the world is relayed to our retina through the iris. Like the pinhole in a simple camera, the iris restricts the entry of light into our eye to a tiny area. In this way, light coming from a particular direction in the field of view is only able to fall on a particular area of the retina. With this, directionality is sustained, and each area in the field of view has its corresponding place on the retina. The tiny opening restricts objects from overlapping on the retina. To state this another way, if there were no small opening that restricted the incoming light, it would be the same as trying to take a photo by simply holding up a light-sensitive surface, the camera sensor on its own, to the scene. Nothing would register on that surface, or more correctly, everything would register everywhere, and there would be no individual thing to see. The restricted view imposed by the small opening of the iris renders the coherent view of reality we know. And we've no way of knowing what is present prior to this perception and prior to the restriction imposed by the iris. How would the world appear if I don't structure what I see with an image through a pinhole? This makes a strange tale. When the pinhole opens wider, the image becomes blurry and quickly dissolves into everything everywhere all at once. When the pinhole closes, there's nothing visible. In the process of reducing the opening to just a little before it completely closes, all of a sudden, the visible world appears. Thus, all we see reveals itself in a transitional moment between everything everywhere and nothing nowhere. Is this a metaphor for what matter and reality are, or is it much more than a metaphor? Could it be that what constitutes the material world is spread everywhere through everything, and like the iris and the camera pinhole, we need to restrict this state of everything everywhere to bring something of it into view? Could it be that the tiny opening is the limitation that is necessary for three-dimensional space to become intelligible to us? Only by limiting the totality of what is to a fraction can we gain access to the physical world and say, yes, I see you and the flowers and the mountain behind. A similar and parallel tale can be proposed that describes our temporal display, showing how the restriction to a limited duration gives presence to auditory perception. The spatial here and the temporal now require a drastic limitation of all that is so as to form a world we can perceive. This epilogue seems to be poetry as much as science. It's intriguing how the search for matter carries us out to the unknowable and then back to what is intelligible to our nature and becomes our world. Matter holds the balance between everything and nothing, between presence and absence, and between subject and object. Intuitively, we know what matter is, but only when we allow matter to unravel and display its full implications do we approach an understanding of what exactly we are asking with the question, what can matter be?